The gateway between Africa and Asia. The Holy Land. Palestine, Israel. No land was ever as contested, no territory as desired by as many peoples. The history of this land, both rich in peace and ravaged by war, is a long and troubled one. An unbroken chain of war and hatred. The eternal war for the land of God resurfaced again on October the 7th, 2023, turning the eyes of the whole world back to Jerusalem. But to truly understand this new chapter, we need to start from the times of Assur and Babylon and take a stroll through 3,000 years of war. Between the 10th and 9th century BCE, right in the middle of the Iron Age, two Jewish kingdoms rose to prominence in the land we now know as Palestine, Israel and Judah, the first in the north, the latter in the south. These two entities shared their territory with a third element, a people who immigrated from the Aegean Sea called the Philistines. Centuries of conquest. The name Palestine, while contested and used in different forms during different ages, came from the origin, land of the Philistines, Philistia, used by the Greeks to name the region, even if most of it wasn't dominated by their long-lost cousins. In the ancient Middle East, stability was only obtained by overwhelming force, as the lack of true geographical barriers meant that a newly dominant kingdom could always expand, like a bowling ball hitting pin after pin, submitting every competitor in the region. This is what happened between the 8th and 7th century, with the rise of Assyria. The kingdom of Israel was first made a vassal, then finally conquered and wiped from the map by the unmerciful Assyrian expansion. Every great power ruling the Middle East at the time had to contend with the possibility that a new bowling ball would start rolling, just as they did to assume control. In order to stop the next militant people from gaining momentum, they adopted inhumane strategies, displacing their enemies into far territories, butchering entire tribes for the crime of not completely submitting to their conquerors. Sargon II exiled at least 27,000 people from Israel, resettling them in lands far away all over the empire. The kingdom of Judah was now on the path of the Assyrians, but they didn't allow the lessons learned by the fall of Israel to go unheard. Their salvation was in their fortifications, as Jerusalem was a stronghold almost unique in the region. The empire of Assur left them alone, sure that they were too small to be a threat. But Judah would fall nonetheless, crushed between Egypt and Babylon in the conflict for absolute power that followed the fall of the Assyrians. In 587 BCE, Jerusalem was destroyed, the Temple of Solomon razed to the ground, and the Jewish tribes were again exiled. The Jewish tribes were allowed to return to Palestine when the Persians rose to prominence, under the protection and tutelage of Cyrus the Great and his heirs. In the second half of the 4th century BCE, Alexander the Great led his army through Palestine, and after his death, the Diadochi, his great generals, fought to tear apart his empire into their own personal kingdoms. Palestine, a gem surrounded by new greedy contenders, was passed around war after war, and a new heavyweight was about to enter the Mediterranean scene: Rome. From Rome to Islam. One after the other, conqueror after conqueror came and went. Some, like the Persians, ruled from a distance, leaving the Jewish communities to handle their own local affairs, while others, such as the successors of Alexander, influenced the local culture greatly, forcefully when necessary. In 63 BCE, Palestine was conquered by the Roman general Pompey and was quickly absorbed into the empire. Jewish culture clashed heavily with Rome, as their absolute belief that only one God existed was a violation of one of the core Roman laws to maintain stability, the Pax Deorum. Pax Deorum, in simple terms, dictated that every subject from the empire had a right to choose his own gods, but had to respect the rights of others to make the same choice. 3 times the Jewish tribes rose up against Rome. Both religion and the political aspiration to again rule themselves contributed to these wars, entangled together so deeply it was impossible to tell them apart. Rome didn't take kindly to rebellion, and the consequences were dire as Jerusalem was destroyed, along with the Second Temple, during the First War of 66 BCE. What remained of the Jewish population in Palestine was forcefully displaced, conflict after conflict. And in the end, they were almost completely pushed out, forced to move and find a home elsewhere, mostly under the umbrella of their new persecutors in Christian Europe. Christianity, newly born, quickly rose from a Jewish sect to an important religion, practiced by many along the Mediterranean coast. Jews, already seen as unreliable elements among the empire, were now targeted for the sin of killing Jesus Christ in the eyes of the Christians. Jerusalem became a holy site for a whole new religion, turning any hope of an independent kingdom of Israel into an unachievable dream. Between 636 and 640 CE, the new and final addition to the monotheistic religion based on the Bible entered Palestine, as Islam exploded on the international stage, conquering half of the Mediterranean coast at breakneck speed. For a while, being among the people of the book, Jews were allowed to Jerusalem in small communities, but most of their population remained in Christian Europe. With the rise of the Ottoman Empire at the tail end of the 15th century, stability came back to Palestine after the chaos of the Middle Ages. Crusades and Mongol invasions had devastated the Holy Land, but after the Ottoman Turks took control of the area, centuries of relative peace followed. At the end of the 19th century, the Jewish community in Palestine started to grow, as the decentralized administration of the empire allowed them to freely conduct their life as dhimmi, or protected people. Around 24,000 were considered to be living in the region in 1882, and when the First World War shook the world in 1914, the number had risen to 94,000. What was an acceptable minority to the Arab locals was rapidly becoming an unacceptable invasion. The British Mandate. In 1918, when the Great War ended and the Ottoman Empire collapsed on itself, Palestine was immediately occupied by the British Empire. The occupation was meant to be temporary, and began with the specific idea of facilitating the creation of a Jewish state, trying at the same time to avoid conflict with the Arab majority living in Palestine. With this new, clear hope of a renewed Israel, Jewish immigration immediately peaked. In Jerusalem alone, the Jewish population almost tripled between 1905 and 1922, and more than doubled in the entire region. In order to understand the violent Arab reaction to what happened under the British Mandate, it is important to understand this series of earth-shaking events. Historian Arnold J. Toynbee, in 1968, pointed at the fact that the Arab population of Palestine had every reason to believe that, just as many of their neighbors, they were being set on a course that would lead to their own independent state. The frustration of their political aspirations combined with the endemic religious animosity toward the growing Jewish population, violence was inevitable. In 1920, blood was spilled in Jerusalem. Violence briefly engulfed the city as the Arab population lashed out against the growing Jewish immigrants. 9 died in the streets, 4 being Arabs, and hundreds of Jews were injured during the violent demonstration. In Europe, the late 30s were proving to be a nightmare for the Jewish community. Fascism roared, and Palestine became a refuge, as immigration soared to unprecedented levels. In 1936, the Great Palestinian Revolt exploded, attempting to stop the march to a new Israel. The conflict started with a general strike and developed into a violent confrontation, where thousands of Arabs were mowed down by the British garrison. Meanwhile, the numbers of Jews escaping from Nazi Germany in 1939 far exceeded the immigration limits set by the British for Palestine, of 15,000 people per year. All who came after that number was reached were deported elsewhere, forced to make do in places such as the Mauritius Islands off the coast of Madagascar. A new world war was coming, and the struggle for the Holy Land was about to change forever. The impossible peace. A first peace conference between Palestinian and Jewish leaders was attempted in London on February of 1939 by the British, who warned that if no compromise was reached, they would impose a solution. The Palestinian delegation's refusal to sit in the same room as the Jewish one meant that the conference was split into 2, both failing to reach an agreement with the British authorities. This failure resulted in the attempt by the British to enforce their will through the White Paper, a policy that would have led to the creation of a joint Arab-Jewish state. No one could predict what World War II would truly mean for the Jewish population of Europe, and when the dust finally settled, the political situation had completely changed. The attempted genocide by the Nazis massively moved public opinion on the side of the Jewish struggle for the first time in history. The White Paper plan of a joint state was now seen as unacceptable, and the creation of a solely Jewish state became an absolute imperative. In 1948, the British Mandate ended, and the future of Palestine hung in the balance. With no solution to the conflict between Arabs and Jews in sight, the United Nations attempted a simple, geographical solution. A partition plan was proposed in 1947, leaving Jerusalem as an international city in the middle of the Palestinian zone. The plan was accepted by the Jewish representatives, but completely rejected by the Arabs. Violence erupted immediately, with causalities on both sides, and quickly sectarian persecution escalated into civil war. The Palestinian War of 1948 was both a political and a military affair. The newborn Jewish paramilitary forces, named Haganah, fought for months on the defensive, hoping that the UN partition would take effect and suffering heavy losses as the Arab side attacked again and again, trying to reach Jewish settlements. In May, when the chance for a resolution had finally disappeared, the Israeli forces lashed out, defeating both local Arab forces and the Arab Liberation Army, a force formed by volunteers from various Islamic countries, in one swift offensive. The War of 48, while brief, was the theater for unexpected alliances. Haganah was supported by both the United States and Soviet Union, and could count on stockpiles of World War II equipment and on many highly trained veterans, Jews, who fought on the side of the Allies. On the other side, the Arab forces were accompanied by remnants of the Nazi regime as small numbers of both Wehrmacht veterans and Waffen-SS officers joined the fight against the Jews one more time. When the war ended on May 14, 1948, more than 700,000 Palestinians had been driven off from their homes by the Israeli advance, and the borders of Israel had expanded, enforced by peace treaty instead of the now dead UN partition plan. Israel was a free nation again after 2,668 years from the fall of the kingdom, but was surrounded by hostile powers. As Jordan absorbed much of the Palestinian refugees, who quickly became a majority in the country, the seeds of another war were already being planted. The Egyptian-Israeli Wars. The Cold War and its constant tension between the two greatest powers in the world was a comfortable political situation for Israel to develop. And while the tension between them and the Palestinians kept rising, no major conflict erupted until 1967. The first domino that led to war was moved by Gamal Abdel Nasser, who declared on May the 22nd that the Strait of Tiran would be closed off to Israeli shopping vessels. Israel had already declared in 1956 that any attempt to close this key trade route would be considered an act of war, and both nations immediately prepared for conflict, mobilizing both armies and diplomacy to enforce their will. Israel could see that it was about to be surrounded by a vast alliance of Arab states. Nasser had signed a defensive alliance with Jordan on May the 30th, and Iraqi troops were entering Jordan themselves, mobilizing to prepare for war as the strait remained closed. The decision was finally taken. Attack before the Arab alliance could completely set themselves up. On the battlefield, the Cold War was in full display. Soviet equipment was being used by all Arab countries, while Israel was deploying the full might of the West. Even the mighty M48 Patton was used, a standard-bearer in American armored tech. Israel's preemptive strike was strikingly effective. Both US and British observers had predicted that they would wipe out the opposition in a few days. But to see the Arab war defeated on the field in 6 was an impressive feat that left a remarkable impression on public opinion everywhere. The Jewish state wasn't a land of Holocaust victims anymore, but a major player in the Middle East. As a result of the 6 Days' War, Israel territory expanded in all directions. In the north, they took the Golan Heights. In the east, the West Bank. In the south, both the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip. Israel achieved a complete victory in 1956, but was again under attack in 1973 when Egypt and Syria, bolstered by expeditionary forces from most of the Arab war, launched a surprise attack during the Yom Kippur festivities. Again, even with the surprise advantage, Israel prevailed in less than 3 weeks. The tension between Egypt and Israel was finally put to rest in 1978 during the Camp David Accords. The compromise allowed Egypt to take back Sinai in exchange for their recognition of the Israeli state. Now, the conflict was about to move inside Israel borders, on the far more complex battlefield of fourth-generation warfare. Occupation. The eternal siege. As a result of the many conflicts between Israel and its neighbors, the Jewish-controlled territory had expanded, leaving no room for Palestine and its people. Frustration grew again, leading to a long series of armed protests. The First Intifada, an umbrella term identifying the larger grassroots struggle, lasted from 1987 to 1993. This first confrontation between Israel and the people of the now occupied Palestine, represented by the Palestine Liberation Organization, ended with the Oslo Peace Accords. During these peace talks, Yasser Arafat, chairman of the PLO, and Yitzhak Rabin, president of Israel, reached an agreement facilitated by U.S. President Bill Clinton. The Palestinian population areas were allowed a limited ability to govern themselves, and the idea to solve the eternal conflict for Palestine by dividing it in two independent states was again taken into consideration. While steps were taken toward the possibility of a Palestinian state, progress was slow and ephemeral, difficult to quantify, leading to another, even more violent explosion that started just as the new millennium began, the Second Intifada. For years the uprising kept raging. Civilian areas were occupied by the Israeli military, while suicide bombers and armed uprisings raged through the country. Thousands died on both sides, and in 2005, Israel disengaged from the Gaza Strip in an attempt to stop the bloodshed. The power vacuum left by Israel's retreat allowed the rise of a new, more extremist paramilitary Palestinian organization in control of the Strip, Hamas. The conflict had finally found its terrible, lethal stability, as open combat turned into a slower siege. In order to stop Hamas from procuring weapons to use against them, Israel closed Gaza into a stranglehold, a blockade that was enforced with ruthless efficiency. At the same time, Hamas had taken every step possible to keep up an almost continuous stream of rocket bombardments, using every possible smuggling technique to keep the flow of weapons going. As the growth of new Jewish settlements in Palestinian land accelerated, tension started growing again. The war between Hamas and Israel has been going on since the group took control of the Strip. And while prisoners have been exchanged and ceasefires been agreed, it was never truly resolved. The Abraham Accords of 2020, a milestone moment for the relationship between Israel and its Arab neighbors, had the unexpected result of isolating the Palestinians even more, as those they could consider to be on their side of the conflict began diplomatic relations with their enemy. On October 7, 2023, an unexpected Hamas attack infiltrated Israel, leading to more than 1,200 killed, with 200 more kidnapped and brought back into Gaza. This unprecedented assault led to a massive Israeli retaliation that is still to reveal its consequences to the world. The Six-Day War was an incredible military achievement, the result not only of Israeli efficiency, but also of the equipment used by them. If you'd like to know more about the legendary M48 tank, click to find out, and subscribe for more.